They assumed she was naive, the kind who married love and lost everything. But when the court uncovered the origin of the marriage contract, murmurs spread, because the truth behind her vows wasn't romantic. It was strategic. My name is Ilara Vance, and for 5 years the world saw me as the perfect doting wife of tech mogul Julian Thorne. The glittering charity galas, the curated social media smiles, the quiet support from behind his throne of money and influence, they all painted a picture of a woman who'd won the lottery. A woman who would be shattered when he filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, and flanked by a wall of the city's most ruthless lawyers. They thought I'd cling, desperate. They thought I'd break, pleading for scraps of the empire I'd supposedly done nothing to build. But I walked into that courtroom with my head held high and a single locked briefcase. Julian's team smirked, ready to dismantle the gold digger. The judge expected tears. What no one expected was for me to be the one calling the first witness, and to submit into evidence not a plea for alimony, but a forensic audit of my own. The real divorce began not with his filing, but 7 years ago, with a single clause in a document everyone else had forgotten. This is the story they never saw coming. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button and comment where you're watching from. The air in the courtroom was a sterile cocktail of lemon-scented polish and simmering aggression. From my seat at the plaintiff's table, I watched Julian's attorney, Ms. Driscoll, pace before the bench like a panther finishing a satisfying hunt. Her closing arguments for the preliminary hearing weren't arguments. They were an elegantly crafted character assassination. "Your Honor, the narrative is, unfortunately, a common one," Driscoll said, her voice a blend of pity and precision. She gestured toward Julian, who sat with perfect, pained dignity, his gaze fixed on the judge with soulful regret. "A driven man, a visionary, builds an empire from sweat and brilliance, and into his life comes a woman of considerable charm, but of no comparable substance. She is elevated, adorned, and indulged. For years, my client provided a life of extraordinary luxury. The apartments, the private jets, the endless parade of couture." She paused, letting the inventory of my supposed decadence hang in the air. "And what was given in return? Companionship, yes. A public face. But when the pressures of steering a billion-dollar company became immense, when my client needed a true partner, he found only a dependent, a consumer of the wealth she played no part in creating." I kept my hands folded on the cool walnut table, my breathing even. The portrait she painted was masterful. Ilara Vance, the ambitious social climber who'd hit the jackpot. The gold digger who would now be shattered, clawing for a settlement to maintain her extravagant habits. I could feel the eyes of the media in the back row, hungry for this salacious, simple story. The judge, an older man with weary eyes, glanced at me, and I saw a flicker of that predictable sympathy. He'd seen 100 versions of me in this room, he thought. Tearful, entitled, desperate. What he didn't see was the cold, crystalline focus behind my calm expression. As Driscoll spoke, I wasn't hearing an attack. I was conducting a strategic analysis. Emotional appeal, base level. Framing the marital estate as solely his premarital asset, a common tactic. Leveraging gender stereotypes, successful husband, ornamental wife, predicted this, stage 1 of their playbook. My pulse didn't quicken. My palms didn't sweat. I had annotated this script 7 years ago. Julian's sigh was a work of art, just audible enough to convey a burden too heavy to bear. He caught my eye for a split second. There was no regret in that look, only a faint, smug anticipation. He thought I was already broken. He thought I'd walk out of here with nothing but the clothes on my back, which he'd probably try to bill me for. The memory of his filing day flashed. The papers served at our home, the cold statement from his PR team about moving forward amicably, the immediate freezing of our joint accounts. The hour was a fiction. They'd always been his. But they hadn't found the vault. They didn't even know it existed. My client seeks a dissolution that reflects reality, Driscoll concluded, smoothing her immaculate skirt. The prenuptial agreement signed by both parties is clear, equitable, and binding. It provides a modest, transitional support for Ms. Vance, which is frankly more than generous given the complete lack of contribution to the marital estate. We ask the court to enforce it and end this painful spectacle. The judge nodded, making a note. Mr. Chen, he said, turning to my attorney, Ben. Your response? Ben, a man of quiet intensity who reminded me of a coiled spring, stood. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. Your Honor, opposing counsel has told you a compelling story. A fairy tale, really. But this court deals in facts, evidence, and the full scope of legally binding contracts. He lifted a single slim document from the table. This is the prenuptial agreement dated June 14th. My client acknowledges her signature. Driscoll allowed herself a small, tight smile. Julian's shoulders relaxed a millimeter. Checkmate, they thought. Ben then turned and picked up a second, thicker file from his chair. However, this document, he said, his voice gaining a resonant edge, is Exhibit B, the annex to the prenuptial agreement, executed concurrently on the same date and legally inseparable from the primary document. The silence that followed was instantaneous and profound. The court reporter's fingers froze for a second. Driscoll's smile vanished, replaced by a swift professional confusion. Julian's head snapped toward his lawyer, a question in his eyes she couldn't answer. Objection, Your Honor! Driscoll was on her feet, her composure cracked. This is the first we're hearing of any annex. This document is not referenced in the filed prenuptial agreement. I question its authenticity and its relevance. Ben didn't flinch. Its relevance, Your Honor, is that it is the prenuptial agreement. The document the respondent filed is, at best, half of the contract. At worst, a deliberate omission. We have provided certified copies to the court and opposing counsel this morning. Its authenticity is readily verifiable. The judge took the file, his brows lowering as he peered at the first page. The murmurs from the gallery began, a rising wave of curiosity. I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes on Julian. The color was draining from his face, the carefully constructed mask of weary dignity crumbling into genuine panicked shock. He remembered. After all these years, in the vault of his arrogance, he'd forgotten the one piece of paperwork that didn't favor him. The judge looked up. Counsel, approach the bench. As Ben and a flustered Driscoll moved forward, the courtroom dissolved into a chaotic whisper. I let my mind drift back, not to the glamour or the lies, but to the beginning. To the origin of the annex. It started not with a ring, but with a spreadsheet. 7 years ago, Thorntech was a flashy startup with a bleeding burn rate and a CEO who thought revenue forecasts were for pessimists. I was the junior associate from Merritt and Lowe sent to diagnose the patient. Julian Thorne was all chaotic energy and visionary buzzwords, pacing a conference room littered with prototype circuit boards. They don't get it, Alara, he'd said, flashing that disarming boyish grin. They're thinking quarters, I'm thinking decades. I'd spent 3 nights sleepless, cross-referencing their cap table, their contracts, their pending litigation. You're thinking decades, I said, my voice calm. But you'll be bankrupt in 18 months. Your Series B funding is structured to dilute you into a footnote. And this IP infringement suit from Vector Dynamics isn't a nuisance. It's an existential threat. They have prior art from 2009 that invalidates your core patent. He'd stared at me, the grin gone. Not angry, but intrigued. He was a predator who'd just found a new, fascinating species. I helped him renegotiate the funding terms. I found the weak point in Vector's case and devised the settlement strategy. He called me his secret weapon. Our dinners became strategy sessions, then became something else. Or so I'd let myself believe. The private proposal came not on a knee, but over a late-night scotch in his messy apartment. The company was stabilized for the moment. He was buzzing with relief and ambition. I need you, Alara, permanently. Be my partner. In everything. His eyes were bright, earnest. The romance of it almost swayed me. Almost. But I had seen my father's eyes, bright with passion for a doomed restaurant venture, right before he lost everything, the house, my college fund, my mother's light. I had felt the powerlessness of watching a life dismantled by poor strategy and blind trust. Love, I had learned, was not a shield. It was often the vulnerability through which devastation entered. A true partnership, I said, my voice steady, requires clear terms, protections, for both of us. He'd laughed a little. A prenup? Of course. My lawyers will draft something fair. My lawyer will draft the annex, I corrected. I told him about my father, about the smell of failure and the silence that followed. It was the only true card I showed him. I will stand beside you, Julian. I will help you build your empire. But I will never, ever be left with nothing again, not even by you. He'd agreed, of course. He was in love with the idea of me, the brilliant savior who believed in him. He saw the annex as a romantic gesture, a quirk to appease my feminine fears. He signed it in Maya's office without really reading it, more focused on the dinner reservation he'd made after. He didn't understand its mechanical heart. The silo clause, walling off my past and future self from his world. The contribution ledger, a cold running tally of my intellectual equity. The trigger, a silent sentinel waiting for this exact moment of betrayal and deceit. Ms. Driscoll, the judge's voice cut through my memory, sharp with impatience. You've had 10 minutes. I've reviewed the notarization and the cross-references. This document appears valid on its face. Your objection to admission is overruled. The gavel cracked. Court is in recess for 1 hour. Upon reconvening, we will begin proceedings with the full contractual framework in evidence. Chaos erupted. Reporters scrambled for the doors. Julian stood up so fast his chair screeched, leaning over to hiss something at Driscoll, who was frantically shuffling through the newly delivered pages. His face was a masterpiece of dawning horror. He finally looked at me, not with smugness, but with a raw, bewildered fury. I met his gaze, my expression unchanged. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply let him see the calm, calculating woman he'd never truly known. The woman who had always been reading the fine print. Ben touched my elbow. You okay? I nodded, gathering my notepad. The first move was made. The public facade was cracked. As I rose, the whispers of the gallery followed me out. Did you see his face? What's in that document? She doesn't look upset at all. The narrative was shifting. The story of the naive gold digger was dying, and from its ashes the truth began, line by line, clause by clause, to unfold. The low hum of the courtroom after the recess was a different creature entirely. The bored anticipation was gone, replaced by a sharp electric focus. Every spectator, every reporter, sat leaning slightly forward, as if pulled by the gravity of the unknown document now entered into evidence. The annex sat on the clerk's desk, an unassuming stack of paper that had become the axis on which the entire case spun. Julian and Ms. Driscoll had their heads together in a frantic whispered conference, their previous swagger replaced by a palpable tension. He kept shooting glances at the bench, at the damning file, at me. The predator was now cornered, and he didn't know the size of the cage. Ben's first witness was the cornerstone. The defense calls Maya Reyes to the stand. My friend of 15 years walked to the front of the courtroom with a calm, unhurried grace. She was not my emotional support. She was my architect. Sworn in, she sat perfectly composed, her hands resting lightly on the rail. Ben established her credentials. Harvard Law, partner at Sterling and Gray, a specialist in high-net-worth estate and marital contracts. Ms. Reyes, did you draft a legal document for my client, Elara Vance, in June of 2017? Ben asked. I did. A contractual addendum to a standard prenuptial agreement, referred to as the Annex. And were both parties to the upcoming marriage, Ms. Vance and Mr. Thorne, represented during its creation? They were. I represented Ms. Vance. Mr. Thorne was advised to seek independent counsel. He chose to waive that right in writing after I explained the document's implications to him personally. He stated, and I recall this clearly, "If it makes Elara feel secure, I'll sign it. I'm not going to need a lawyer against my own wife." Maya's voice was dry, factual. A ripple went through the room. Ben had her walk through the core clauses. The silo clause, a legally fortified trust established before marriage, containing her family's salvaged assets and a percentage of her future independent income, wholly separate from the marital estate. The contribution ledger, a confidential, verifiable record of strategic, non-domestic contributions to Thorne Tech, to be maintained by Ms. Vance. And finally, the trigger, a provision that voided the limited settlement of the main prenup if, during divorce proceedings, one party could prove infidelity coupled with a deliberate attempt to conceal or dissipate marital assets. In simple terms, Ms. Reyes, Ben summarized, the annex was not about planning for divorce. It was about defining the terms of the marriage itself as a strategic partnership, correct? Objection. Calls for a legal conclusion. Driscoll snapped. Sustained, the judge said, but he was looking at Maya, his earlier weariness replaced by keen interest. The witness may describe the intent as she understood it from her client. The intent, Maya said, turning slightly to address the judge directly, was to translate intangible contributions, strategy, insight, emotional labor, career sacrifice, into tangible, legally recognizable equity. It was a framework to prevent exactly this scenario, where the financial actor claims total ownership of an empire built, in part, on the invisible capital of the other. Driscoll's cross-examination was a desperate attempt to claw back ground. Ms. Reyes, isn't this so-called annex highly unusual? Unorthodox, even? It is precise, Maya countered. Partnership agreements between business founders are often far more detailed. This simply applied that rigor to a marital partnership where one party's contributions were likely to be non-traditional and, historically, undervalued. And this contribution ledger, a secret diary of grievances, did you ever see it? It was not a diary. It was a business record. And no, as per the agreement, it remained in Ms. Reyes Vance's possession unless and until its validity was challenged in a forum like this. Driscoll sat down, frustrated. The foundation was laid, rock solid. Next, Ben called a reluctant witness, a retired Thorne Tech board member named Robert Alden. A man in his 70s, he had the air of someone who wished to be anywhere else. Mr. Alden, you served on Thorne Tech's board from its Series B to your retirement 2 years ago, is that correct? It is. During that time, did you have interactions with Ms. Vance beyond social events? Alden shifted in his seat. Yes. Julian, Mr. Thorne, would sometimes have her join strategic dinners, informal sounding boards. Can you recall a specific instance where her input was notable? Alden sighed, a man betraying an old loyalty to a higher law. The Etherix acquisition, late 2019. Julian was hot to go. Big splash, synergistic technology, or so the pitch went. We had a dinner. Elara, Ms. Vance, was quiet for most of it. Then she asked one question about Etherix's licensing revenue from a patent filed in South Korea, a revenue stream that wasn't in the prospectus. It sparked a line of inquiry. Turned out the revenue was fictional, a shell game. The whole deal was rotten. He paused. We walked away. Julian credited her at the table, said, "My wife has a killer instinct for numbers. She just saved us $100 million and a world of hurt." The flashback was visceral. The private dining room, the smell of seared scallops and expensive cologne. Julian holding court, energized by the prospect of the deal. Me, running the numbers in my head all night. The discrepancy in the international filings nagging like a sore tooth. I'd waited, spoken softly. The sudden silence from the etheric CFO had been all the confirmation I needed. Julian's proud boast afterward. My smile had been genuine then, for the victory, for the partnership. That night I'd gone home and opened the secure digital ledger. 11-14-19 Etherix due diligence. Identified fraudulent revenue reporting. Deal terminated. Estimated loss prevented $120. I'd felt not like a wife, but like a chief risk officer. It was the last time I felt truly seen by him. Ben moved in for the kill. "Mr. Alden, in your experience, was it common for the spouse of a CEO to provide that level of strategic insight at board-level discussions?" "Objection! Relevance!" Driscoll was on her feet. "Overruled. The witness may answer." Alden looked pained. "No, it was not common. It was unique." Ben let that hang before proceeding to his pièce de résistance. He recalled me to the stand. The air grew thicker. This was the moment the gallery had been waiting for. The weeping wife, the defensive gold digger. Ben's questions were gentle but direct. "Ilara, you had a promising career at Meriden Lowe. Why did you leave?" I looked at the jury, then at the judge, finding a focal point in the middle distance. It was presented as a choice, but it was a strategic necessity. As Thorntech grew, Julian's role as the charismatic, unimpeachable visionary became its most valuable asset. He needed a unified front, a partner who could manage the social capital, the philanthropy, the narrative. My voice was clear, devoid of self-pity. We discussed it as a business decision. My leaving my job would increase the company's valuation by presenting stability and a certain traditional image that investors, ironically, found reassuring. In return, my contributions would shift form and be recognized under the framework of the annex. I didn't stop working. The work changed. "And did you make any direct financial contributions to Thorntech in its early, precarious days?" This was the secret I'd held closest. "Yes." 6 months before our wedding, the Vector Dynamics IP lawsuit was still pending. The settlement demand was significant, enough to cripple the company's runway. Julian's investors were getting cold feet. He was terrified. I could still see the haunted look in his eyes, the first time I'd seen true fear in the boy king. He didn't ask. I offered. I liquidated a portfolio from my silo trust, an inheritance from my grandmother I'd been carefully growing. I transferred the funds through a neutral third-party legal firm to satisfy the settlement. It was the capital that allowed Thorntech to proceed to its Series B, debt-free from that litigation. Ben entered the evidence. Bank records, transfer slips, the settlement dismissal from the court docket. The amount was displayed on a screen. A collective sharp inhale came from the gallery. It was a staggering sum even now. Julian was staring at me, his face a mask of utter shock. He had never known. He'd thought the lawsuit just went away. He'd taken the win and never looked back. The realization that his first kingdom had been bought with my quiet coin was dawning on him, and it was devastating. "Why didn't you tell him?" Ben asked, the question everyone was thinking. "Because it wasn't a loan," I said, my gaze finally settling on Julian. His eyes were wide, uncomprehending. "It was an equity investment, in the company and in us. Telling him would have changed it, made it a debt, a power dynamic. I wanted it to be a foundation, silent, strong, and holding everything up." The courtroom was silent, The story of the greedy wife evaporated in the face of this act of profound secret faith. Now Ben pivoted to the kill. Ilara, did there come a time when you believed the terms of the annex, specifically the trigger clause, had been activated? Yes. Please explain. I described the distance, the late nights, the new COO, Sienna Reed, who hung on his every word with a professional fervor that blurred lines. I described the instinct, honed from years of reading financial statements and people, that told me the shift was more than stress. I hired a discreet investigator. The evidence was clinical. Hotel receipts, garage records, photos of them together at a remote weekend industry conference that none of his other executives attended. Ben entered the evidence. Driscoll objected weakly, but the adultery was the lesser blow. It was the preamble. And following your discovery of the infidelity, Ben continued, his voice dropping a register, did you observe any unusual activity regarding your joint marital assets? I did. Approximately 8 months ago, I noticed anomalies in the statements from our joint investment holding company. Unexplained transfers to a shell corporation in Luxembourg I'd never heard of. When I asked Julian, he became evasive, then angry. He told me I didn't understand the complex tax strategies his new finance team was implementing. What did you do? I engaged a forensic accountant. The same week Julian filed for divorce, we received the preliminary report. Ben entered the final, devastating packet. A flowchart appeared on the screen, a spiderweb of transfers from marital accounts into offshore entities, culminating in a trust beneficially owned by a holding company linked to Sienna Reed's brother. The timeline was clear. The siphoning began 6 months before the divorce filing. The attempt, I said, my voice cold and final, was not just to leave me. It was to impoverish me, to render me powerless. He triggered the clause, Your Honor. Not me. The dam broke. Driscoll's objections were a frantic, futile staccato. Julian had slumped in his chair, his face ashen, all his arrogance gone, replaced by the stunned look of a man who has carefully rigged a game only to discover the rules were written in a language he never bothered to learn. The judge called for a recess, his gavel echoing in the stunned silence. As I stepped down from the stand, I didn't look at the gallery. I didn't look at the crumbling man at the defendant's table. I looked at Maya, who gave me the slightest, imperceptible nod. The sacrifice had been laid bare. The trigger had been proven. The invisible architecture of my marriage, built not on dreams but on concrete and steel, stood exposed, and it was his castle of lies that lay in ruins around it. The final day of trial dawned with the brittle clarity of a settled matter. The air in the courtroom no longer crackled with uncertain tension. It hummed with a somber, inevitable gravity. Julian sat ramrod straight at the defense table, but it was the posture of a statue, hollow and fixed. The charming veneer had been stripped away, leaving behind a man whose eyes were dark with a simmering mixture of fury and dread. Ms. Driscoll's opening statement was a study in damage control, a limp attempt to reframe the narrative around misunderstandings and the heat of a failing marriage. But her words fell like stones into a deep well, creating no ripple. The judge listened with an impassive face, his notes already extensive. When it was Julian's turn to take the stand for the final time, he moved with a stiff, almost mechanical gait. Under Ben's calm, relentless questioning, the last of his defenses crumbled. Yes, he had been aware of the annex. No, he hadn't fully appreciated its legalese. Yes, he had engaged in a relationship with Sienna Reed. His attempts to justify it, the pressure, the isolation at the top, Ilara was always so analytical, sounded pathetic even to his own ears, echoing in the silent room. But it was when Ben presented the forensic map of the asset transfers, linking them definitively to Sienna's circle, that Julian's composure shattered. His lawyer advised him not to answer. He ignored her. It was a restructuring, he burst out, his voice too loud, fraying at the edges. A complex legal restructuring to protect the company's assets from exactly this kind of predatory— "From what, Mr. Thorne?" Ben interjected, his voice lethally soft. "From your wife's legitimate claim? The transfers began months before you filed. You were advised by Ms. Reed, your subordinate with whom you were romantically involved, to hide marital property. Yes or no?" Julian's jaw worked. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw not hatred but a profound, bewildered resentment. "She was never my wife," he spat, the words bursting from him like a dam breaking. "Not really. She was, a consultant, an auditor. She had a spreadsheet for our wedding vows. She calculated her love. What kind of person does that?" The courtroom gasped. Driscoll put her head in her hands. It was the worst possible thing he could have said. Ben didn't flinch. He let the ugly words hang, let the jury absorb the venom. "What kind of person," Ben repeated slowly, "ensures her partner can't financially obliterate her after betraying her? The court has seen the evidence of who did what to whom, Mr. Thorne. Your witness." Driscoll's redirect was a brief, despairing whisper. Julian stepped down, his moment of volcanic truth having sealed his fate more completely than any legal argument could. Then, it was my turn for a final statement. I didn't need to take the stand. I stood beside my table, facing the judge, my hands steady at my sides. I could feel the eyes of the world on me, but I saw only the neutral, weary face of the man who would decide the rest of my life. "Your Honor," I began, my voice not loud, but clear, carrying to the back of the room. "For the past week, you've heard a story dismantled. The story of the gold digger. It was a compelling fiction, easy to believe. But I would ask you to consider the real story that has emerged in its place." I paused, not for effect, but to find the right words, the true words. It is the story of a partnership, one founded not on blind faith, but on clear-eyed agreement. I loved Julian Thorne. I loved his brilliance, his chaotic energy, his vision. But love is not a substitute for respect, and respect, in a world governed by contracts and capital, must be documented. The annex wasn't a plan for divorce. It was a blueprint for a marriage where both parties' contributions, his very public ones, my very private ones, were recognized as having concrete value. I sacrificed a thriving career to build the social and philanthropic infrastructure that supported his. I invested my own safeguarded inheritance to save his company before it was even ours. I offered strategy and insight, not as a hobby, but as a vested partner. I turned slightly, my gaze sweeping over Julian. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He called me a calculator. He's right. I calculated the risk of loving someone with all his power and none of his protections. I calculated the value of my own mind, my own labor, my own peace. The tragedy is not that I did the math. The tragedy is that he thought the numbers would never be called. Love isn't blind trust. Love is building something together with clear eyes and a safety net for both. I loved him enough to build him a fortress. He loved himself enough to try and lock me out of it. I turned back to the judge. I am not asking for vengeance. I am asking for the court to honor the full contract we both signed, to see the marriage for what it was, and to grant a dissolution that reflects what it truly was, a severed partnership. I sat down. The silence was absolute. The judge's deliberation was surprisingly brief. The evidence was too mountainous, the contractual framework too explicit, the bad faith too blatant. When he returned, his pronouncements were delivered in a crisp, methodical tone that brooked no argument. He found the annex to be a valid, binding, and integrated part of the marital agreement. He found the trigger clause had been activated by Julian's adultery and his deliberate pre-filing concealment of assets. His rulings fell like precise, measured hammer blows. 1. The Silo Trust was affirmed as Ilara Vance's sole and separate property, its value and all subsequent growth irrelevant to the marital estate. 2. The marital estate, including all assets of Thorntech accrued during the marriage, was to be divided on a 50-50 basis, recognizing her non-traditional contributions as substantial and integral to the company's growth. 3. Due to the attempted dissipation of assets, Julian Thorne was ordered to pay a punitive sum equal to 20% of the value of the hidden assets, directly to Ilara Vance, in addition to forfeiting any claim to them. 4. He was ordered to pay 100% of her legal and expert witness fees. 5. Furthermore, based on the evidence of her early capital infusion that saved the company, the court awarded a separate, lump-sum, equitable reimbursement to Ms. Vance from Julian's personal share, with interest calculated from the date of the transfer. It was a total, unequivocal victory, more than I had dared to hope for. It wasn't just a settlement. It was a judicial vindication of every silent calculation, every protected asset, every line in the secret ledger. Outside the courthouse, the media scrum was a roaring beast. Microphones were thrust like spears through the crowd. Julian exited through a side door, head down, flanked by security, ignoring the shouted questions. A lone reporter yelled, "Any comment on the calculator remark, Julian?" He flinched as if struck and disappeared into a waiting black SUV. Minutes later, Ben, Maya, and I walked out the main steps. The sunlight was startlingly bright. I paused, allowing the cameras their moment. I did not smile. I did not cry. I simply stood there, a woman in a simple, elegant suit, holding a briefcase that contained the rest of her life. Ben gave a short, "No comment at this time," and we moved through the gauntlet, arms linked, a united front. 1 month later, the chaos had distilled into quiet order. I sat in a sun-drenched corner office in a renovated brick-and-beam building in the city's innovation district. The brass plaque on the door read, "Vance Solutions." My desk was clean, holding only a laptop, a sleek monitor, and a single photograph. It was not of Julian and me on some exotic beach. It was a faded picture of my parents and me, taken in the backyard of our old home, before the debt, before the loss, before the world taught me its hardest lessons. We were all smiling, unguarded. My first client, a fierce woman named Lena who ran a biomedical AI startup, had just left. Thorntech's venture arm had passed on her, deeming her too niche. My new fund, capitalized by the first distributions from the divorce settlement, had just wired her the seed capital she needed. The irony was not lost on either of us. A courier arrived with a thick, legal-sized envelope. It bore the return address of Driscoll and Vance, the final, fully executed settlement documents. I slit the envelope open, scanned the first page, the numbers aligning with the judge's order, and then set it aside, unread. Its power over me was gone. I picked up the old photograph instead, my thumb tracing the edge. My father's hopeful face, my mother's trusting smile. I had avenged them, in a way. I had broken the cycle of silent financial ruin that followed blind faith. The door to my office opened. Maya leaned in, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "The Lena deal closed?" she asked. "It did," I said, setting the photo down. She came in, handed me a mug, and looked at the unopened legal envelope, then at the photo. A slow smile spread across her face. "So, what does it feel like?" she asked. "Freedom?" I took a sip of the coffee, rich and bitter. I looked out the window at the city skyline, where the Thorntech Tower still gleamed, a needle of glass and ambition. It was no longer a monument to my failure or my fortune. It was just a building, a piece of a skyline I now owned a part of, literally and figuratively. "It feels," I said, the words forming with a truth I hadn't fully articulated until that moment, "like the prologue is finally over." I had loved, not naively, but strategically. I had built, not for us, but for a version of me that needed to survive. The court hadn't given me my worth. It had simply been the auditor, finally called in to verify the ledgers I had been keeping all along. The truth they discovered wasn't a scandal of greed. It was a testimony to foresight. And as the afternoon sun warmed my new desk, in my new office with my oldest friend beside me, the only vow that mattered now was the one I had made to myself, long before I ever said, "I do." The story they thought they knew was finished. Mine was just beginning.